You're tuned to Planet Vero Radio. I am Cindy Schwartz, and this is the Patient Partner Show. We're also podcast on Spreaker and distributed on all its platforms. I'm here today by myself. Jeannie Rollo's taking a couple of hours off to look into some more information about this healthcare. So I think what I want to share with you today is something that I learned, and I know I talked about this on a previous podcast. And it's about a book that I read. It is called Side Effects, and it's written by an investigative journalist who has written quite a bit for the Boston Globe, and definitely in the healthcare field is her expertise. And the book is called Side Effects. It is by Allison Bass. And it talks about the side effects of drugs, Paxil, Prozac, some of the ones that were very well known, forefront of our minds when we think about antidepressant drugs. And her investigation talks about how some of the doctors that wrote a lot of the paperwork on these drugs were also at the same time employed by drug makers, so drug companies. And she explains this as being explains this as being a conflict of interest in a lot of ways, that it has broached different and breached different categories, different lines that you don't think really would have been gone over. And I think you can kind of connect the dots here with where that's going to go. Sadly, at the end of the book, it does say that one of the main doctors, who is a doctor he practices in professorship at Brown University, so a very prestigious Ivy League school, was one of those doctors. And currently, the book was published in 2008, so it is 15 years ago. At that time, was still after the court case was settled in New York State with the Attorney General there. He sadly still remained practicing in Brown University. And what the book went on to explain was how these trials, drug trials, were conducted. And a lot of the side effects, especially the negative side effects, weren't given out to the public. And a lot of times most of the time weren't even given out to the doctors who are prescribing these drugs. With the Paxil specifically, it dealt with a lot of suicide ideology with teenagers and with young adults, and how that was never published in these studies. And so what that court case did do was bring that out. What it demanded of the drug companies was for them to admit to this and have it written on a website that was readily available to the public. So really serious information that people need to make their decisions on what they're going to do for these drugs. But it also took into account, and I know we've talked many times on this podcast about doctors that were indicted, doctors that were charged with criminal charges and things like that. But this one, we also talk about doctors that are fabulous doctors that totally do right by the patients. And it's sad to have those doctors, those nurses, the medical personnel working in the same kind of atmosphere that some of this stuff is going on. Well, one of the key things, the takeaway with this was, and what was about what the lawsuit was about, is that the doctors didn't have the information. So how could they be informing their patients when they themselves were being slighted with these negative side effects? And, their hands are tied because they're doing the best that they can, and they're not even able to tell all of the story. One of the things that did come out, too, in this study that I found was amazing, and Jeannie and I talk about it over and over and over again, just about every podcast, is the trust that is anticipated and expected when you go to your doctor, to your medical provider. And it's called a fiduciary relationship. So fiduciary, a lot of times, is kind of I don't want to say convoluted term, but it's a term that people really are, I don't want to say scared of, but they don't know a lot about. And so what that means, and you've heard of fiduciary investment and things like that. Fiduciary, if you look it up in the dictionary, in any dictionary, the first word that you'll see there is trust. So that's what the relationship is with your doctor. It's a fiduciary relationship. Look it up on your own in any dictionary at all, and it will specifically gear you to that, to trust, that 5-letter word, trust. So what is happening now with a lot of these different healthcare situations, and we brought it up over and over again, where is that fiduciary relationship gone to? Where is that trust gone to? Because I certainly want it back in every avenue that I go to in healthcare, not just doctors that I can point towards that I know these certain doctors have given me that kind of care. I want it to be in every office that I ever walk into. I know that all of us do that. All of us do think that. And the other thing that I want to talk about that case, and the lawyers, brilliant people, were stumped. Certainly there's a lot of assistant prosecutors in those offices, and they were stumped for the longest time. And all of a sudden it came to the one lawyer, Miss Feinstein, and she said what this actually is, not getting all of this information, is deemed consumer fraud. And she went through the different telltale avenues that consumer fraud would have to check off to actually be consumer fraud. And that was what that case was tried about. And Miss Feinstein had also been here in Florida talking with different and working with the child welfare system, and saw so many heinous things happening there with drug conditions where the children were given certain drugs to calm them down, and then unnecessarily kept being given to these children. And there was a court case about that. I believe it's called Bonnie L. v. Jeb Bush, who was the governor then in Florida. So you can look all of this stuff up. But I just find it amazing that these lawyers did have to get a little bit out of the box, if you will, to figure out how they were going to prosecute this case. Again, they prosecuted it under the guise of consumer fraud, and it did go to the whole length of it. The court case was won, if you will, by the prosecution, stemming these charges that the people weren't being given the correct information. So now my question is to everyone, and I'll certainly ask Jeannie when she comes back on the next podcast, is consumer fraud also being given to us when we sign these papers? I mean, this is all my opinion. Sign these papers that say this is what we're agreeing to, and then different things happen before, during, after the surgery, and we're like, wait a minute, I didn't sign that informed consent paperwork for that to happen. No one told me about those things. So I have to bring up the question to myself and to the listeners. Again, in my opinion, is this now consumer fraud because we're not being told enough stuff to make these informed decisions? And I'm not talking about, if you're going to use this yellow Band-Aid or, blah, blah, blah. I'm being kind of facetious here. Certainly, doctors don't know everything going into the situation. Surgeons don't know everything. Medical staff don't know everything. But there are protocols in place. And I call them protocols because I'm going to assume that these protocols are written down somewhere and that is readily available to tell patients. I'm just wondering what all that is about. And I'm wondering it because I read that book, because it's woken me up, sadly, to another aspect of where the drug industry did not do right by the patients, nor the doctors, nor the medical staffs. It's very sad in my opinion, and sad isn't even the right word. It's just it's consumer fraud. It's consumer fraud. That's what they prove. So where do we tackle this going forward in general healthcare? Where do we get the fiduciary trust back in our relationships with our medical providers? Where do we draw the line? If it is consumer fraud, where do we get the information, the solid information for us to make these decisions in these serious situations? And I'm going to leave you with that. Think about that. You've been listening to Planet Vera Radio. Please stay tuned.